The great chamber of the Galactic Council was filled with voices that rose and fell like waves, but under the noise there was a strange fear that no one wanted to name. And the reason was clear, because the humans were gone, and their seats stood, empty and cold. And it felt as if a giant shadow had walked out of the hall, leaving only silence behind. And the aliens kept looking at the place where the humans once sat, as if expecting them to return. But the truth was already known, and it cut through the air heavier than steel. John Carter, the last human ambassador, stood before them, not with anger, but with a calm voice that somehow made the entire chamber grow still. He told them that humanity was finished with carrying the weight of others. He told them that Earth had sent aid fleets to burning colonies when no one else would. He reminded them how humans had defended the trade lanes and how they had offered medicine and food, even when mocked and insulted. And then he said that humans were leaving not because they hated, but because they had been mocked too many times and had been treated like tools and not allies. And then his voice grew quiet, and he said, "Humanity will not return until you learn to stand on your own." The words hit like a silent storm. Many aliens laughed at first, but the laughter had no joy in it because behind it they felt the truth. The chamber fell quiet when John Carter walked out, and the sound of his steps echoed like a warning. The humans followed him in silence, and the sight of their long line of officers and aides leaving the council together made the air grow heavier, as if something ancient had ended. For a long moment no one spoke. The council leader, an old, scaled creature with eyes like glass, tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat, and he only said, "They will be back, they always come back." But no one in the chamber believed it. Not really, because they had seen the look in the human eyes, and it was the look of people who had made their choice and would not turn around again. Outside the chamber, ships were leaving, and alien delegates rushed to the windows to see the sight. The human fleet that had guarded the council world for decades was pulling away, in perfect order, engines glowing like falling stars as they vanished into the dark of space. And the silence that followed was deeper than anything the council had ever known. In the streets below, common aliens whispered that maybe the humans had been right. And some even wept because they remembered how human doctors had saved their families, and how human soldiers had fought beside them, and how human traders had brought them food in times of famine. And the thought that such people were gone now felt like the loss of a shield over their heads. Inside the council, the arguments began. One delegate shouted that humans were arrogant. Another said they had always been strange and untrustworthy. And another said that they had never truly belonged. But the voices soon lost power, because deep inside each of them was the fear that they had made a mistake, and that the mistake could not be undone. The night on the council world was restless. Alien leaders sat in their private quarters and replayed the words of John Carter in their minds, and each of them thought of the same thing. What would happen now, because the galaxy was not kind, and the galaxy respected only strength. And for generations, that strength had been carried on human shoulders, and now those shoulders were gone. John Carter looked once more at the great halls of the council as he prepared to board his shuttle, and he felt no joy, only a quiet sadness, but also a steady resolve. He knew that humanity had given everything it could, and he knew that to stay would mean endless chains. So he whispered to himself as the engines roared behind him, "Let them face what comes," and the shuttle rose into the night sky, leaving behind a council that had never looked so small. The weeks after the humans left passed slowly, and the galaxy began to notice the cracks that spread through everything like small lines in glass. At first, only trade ships complained that repairs took longer without human engineers. Then colonies began to whisper that their medicine supplies were running low because the formulas were human, and no one else truly understood how to make them work soon. Whole trade routes that once carried food and water and medical aid started to fall silent, and alien leaders tried to hide it, but the truth spread faster than they could silence it. Maria Ellis, a young human doctor, had lived on a council colony for years. She had healed wounds and delivered children and taught alien nurses how to clean infections. She had grown to love the strange people she served. But when the humans withdrew, she packed her clinic, her heart heavy, and her patients cried outside her door, their voices begging her not to go. One small child clung to her coat, sobbing, and Maria had to pry the hands away. Her eyes filled with tears, but she left anyway because the order from Earth was final. No human aid would remain in alien space. The sight of her ship rising into the sky was remembered by the colony for years. As the moment Hope left, the council chambers grew restless as angry voices filled the air. One delegate shouted that humans had abandoned them. Another said they could replace them easily, but the quiet looks in their eyes told a different story. They knew that human technology was different. It was adaptable and creative, and even when they copied it, the heart of it was missing. The weeks stretched and colonies far from the core began to riot. Food ships never arrived. Medicines spoiled on arrival because no one knew how to preserve them. The local governments begged for help, but the council kept promising answers that never came. In the markets, common citizens whispered that the council was weak without humans, and the whispers grew. Into angry shouts, merchants refused to sell without protection, and gangs rose to take control. The people remembered that humans had walked their streets unafraid, standing against thieves and raiders with a confidence no alien could match now. Those streets felt darker and colder each night. On one distant world, a small rebellion began. Farmers and workers marched through the capital demanding answers. They held signs with human words painted on them because they had once learned the language. Of their protectors, they shouted, "Bring them back, bring the humans back," but no answer came. The council sent soldiers to silence the protest, but even the soldiers muttered in fear because raiders were attacking nearby systems, and they knew without humans their fleets were too slow, too weak, too divided. In a dark chamber of the council, the leaders argued for hours. One old voice said, "Perhaps we should beg them to return," but the others hissed in shame. To beg would mean admitting weakness. They believed if they showed strength, the humans would respect them. But the truth was clearer. With every passing day, the galaxy was breaking, and no one could stop it. Ships carrying desperate messages slipped through the stars, hoping to reach human space. But none were answered on Earth. The people watched in silence, building their fleets and tending their own worlds, while the council spun in endless circles of blame and denial. John Carter sat in his office on Earth, reading the reports with heavy eyes. He had warned them all. But still, the weight of their collapse pressed on his chest. He knew the galaxy would suffer, but he also knew that sometimes only pain could teach those who refused to listen. The weeks turned into months, and the cracks became fractures. Whole colonies stopped sending taxes to the council instead. Keeping what they had to survive, pirate groups grew bold, attacking shipping lanes with no fear of punishment. One alien captain said in a broadcast, "When humans patrolled, we feared the stars. Now the stars fear nothing," and his words spread across the networks like fire. The council tried to censor it, but it was too late. The people already knew they were living in a galaxy without its guardians. The story of Maria Ellis spread as well. Her patients told it again and again. The day she left was spoken of in hushed voices as if it was the death of something greater than medicine. It was the death of hope, and every colony had a story like hers. A human mechanic, a human teacher, a human soldier, all of them gone, leaving holes that could not be filled, and in those holes despair grew stronger with each day. The council chamber that once felt like the center of the galaxy was drowning in fear. Every seat filled with voices that no longer carried pride, but only doubt. They looked at one another and wondered what had gone wrong. How had the humans who had once stood among them left so quietly and left behind such a heavy shadow? The answer none of them wanted to admit was that they had pushed too hard. They had believed humans were just another young race who would bend or break under pressure, but instead the humans had chosen something far worse. For the council, they had chosen to walk away. And now that silence was louder than any warship, in the empty space where humans had once spoken, there was now nothing, and that nothing cut deeper than any blade. Some leaders demanded to send fleets to Earth and force them back to the table. Others shouted that such an act would doom them all, because every alien in that room remembered what happened to fleets that underestimated humanity. They had seen human fleets fight against impossible odds and win. They had seen soldiers who refused to break even when defeat seemed certain. And they remembered the strange human way of finding victory in places where no logic said it was possible. The memory of those battles burned like fire and stopped their hands from moving. Far from the council on Earth, men and women who had carried the burden of the galaxy now lived with quiet purpose. They were not naive. They knew that their silence frightened the galaxy, but they also knew it gave them space to grow. People like John and Claire worked to rebuild trust among their own kind. They built stronger ships and trained new explorers, but they also taught the younger ones that power without wisdom was dangerous. They told stories not to glorify war but to teach lessons. They spoke of how survival was born not just from strength but from unity. Marcus trained young recruits not with anger, but with patience, reminding them that one day the galaxy would call again and they would have to be ready, in markets across distant colonies. Traders whispered about Earth. Some claimed humans were building weapons beyond imagination. Others said they were reaching for stars the Council had never charted, and still others spoke of a human colony found deep in unmarked space that turned away visitors with only a silent glance, and no one dared test their resolve. Pirates who had once laughed at human courage now avoided even the smallest rumor of Earth ships because legend had grown into something larger than truth. And the more the galaxy feared, the more powerful the humans became. Without lifting a finger, Leah often sat by the riverside near her home, and she would write letters to the Council, not to send them but to remind herself of what was lost. She wrote that trust was fragile, and that once broken it was almost impossible to repair. She wrote that humanity had been willing to share, willing to help, but pride and arrogance had turned allies into enemies, and now silence was their answer. She kept those letters hidden, but in her heart, she knew one day they might be needed, because silence could not last forever, no matter how heavy it felt. Inside the Council, chamber arguments grew hotter every day. A few desperate voices suggested begging humans to return. Others pushed for alliances among themselves, but every attempt failed because none trusted each other. The way they had once trusted, Earth fear had poisoned them, and without a steady hand to guide them, the Council began to crumble. Cracks spread through their treaties, and suspicions spread faster than light. Soon small races who once looked to the Council for safety began to drift away, building their own defenses, searching for their own allies, and in that chaos the galaxy began to change. But Earth watched in silence. John looked at the night sky and told Claire that the galaxy was moving toward another storm. He did not know when or how, but he felt it in his bones. The Council was too divided to survive much longer, and sooner or later, they would come crawling back, not out of respect, but out of desperation. Claire agreed, but she also warned him that when that day came, humanity would have to decide carefully whether to help or to let the galaxy face the cost of its arrogance. She said choices were heavier than weapons, and he knew she was right. The silence of humans was not just absence, it was preparation. It was the calm before something greater, and the galaxy could feel it even if they tried to deny it. The collapse spread like a storm across the Council worlds, and it did not strike all at once but slowly, like a sickness that moved from one part of the body to another. And each time the leaders thought they had contained it, another wound opened and bled. And soon it was clear to all that the galaxy was unraveling without the humans who had once held it together. Food shipments failed to arrive on time. Entire harvests spoiled because the storage systems were human-made, and without the right parts they could not be repaired. Diseases spread among alien populations because the vaccines had been created by human minds, and even when the formulas were copied, something always went wrong, and people began to die in numbers too large. To hide in the cities, the crowds gathered in the squares chanting questions that no one in power could answer. They shouted, "Why did they leave? Why did you drive them away?" And their voices echoed against the tall towers that had once been built. With human help, Council soldiers tried to break the protests, but more rose again and again like waves. The anger turned into violence. Stores were looted, food centers burned, and many shouted that life had been safer under the watch of human fleets. Then, under the rule of the Council Admiral Lena Rogers, a retired ally of humanity, appeared in a broadcast. Her face old, but her eyes sharp. She told the galaxy the truth. She said the humans had carried the weight of the stars on their backs. They had defended borders, fed the hungry, healed the sick, and they had asked for little but respect in return. And instead, they had been mocked, insulted, treated like tools. She spoke of the day John Carter walked out of the chamber, and she said that moment would be remembered as the day the galaxy chose arrogance over survival. Her words spread across millions of systems, carried in secret channels and public ones alike. Her voice broke through the lies of the Council, and people began to believe. Yet on the Council floor, the leaders shouted at each other. Blame filled the air. Some accused the humans of betrayal. Others accused rival species of plotting behind the scenes. But the truth was clear to the common people. The Council had failed them, Worlds that once gave loyalty now threatened to leave. They said, why pay taxes to a body that cannot protect us? Why bow to leaders who cannot feed us? And the shouts grew louder until even the proudest council members trembled. In distant colonies, ships refused to fly the council flag. Pirates declared entire sectors their own governments on smaller worlds, broke away and called themselves free. And in those new governments, the memory of humans was spoken of with both sorrow and respect. They said we drove them away, but they were the ones who kept us safe, and now we must face the dark alone. Inside the homes of common people, stories were told around dim lights. Mothers told their children of the time when human soldiers stood guard at the city gates. Fathers told of the day human engineers repaired the water lines, and neighbors whispered that maybe the humans would return if they were called with honesty. But no one believed it strongly enough to act. The fear of the dark without them was too deep. The council itself was no longer the shining place of order it had once been. It had become a hall of shouting and division. Every meeting ended with slammed doors and broken promises. Some worlds refused to send representatives. At all, their seats stood empty like wounds that would not close. The chamber that once felt strong now felt hollow. The proud banners hung limp, as if they too had lost faith. Meanwhile, the humans thrived far away. Their ships patrolled their own space. Their factories grew louder, their cities brighter. And though they did not interfere, their presence could be felt like a shadow over the stars. Aliens spoke of it with both awe and fear. Humanity had turned inward, but their strength had not vanished. It had grown. The galaxy was crumbling while they stood tall and silent, watching from afar. The council was desperate, and it was clear in their eyes and voices as they sat in the grand chamber that had once been a place of order, but was now filled with fear. Their worlds were falling apart, and the people were crying out for help, and the only help they could think of was the very help they had driven away. So at last they decided to send a mission to Earth, a mission of pleading and hope. Though many felt shame at the thought, fleets were gathered to escort the envoys through dangerous space because the raiders were everywhere now. But even the largest alien fleets looked small compared to what they feared to meet. When they reached the borders of human space, their ships slowed because ahead of them stood colossal warships. Unlike anything they had seen before, they stretched across the stars in perfect lines, their guns silent but their presence heavier than gravity. The alien envoys trembled as their ships were scanned, and their escorts shook with fear because it was clear that if the humans wished they could erase them in seconds. A voice came over their channels, cold and steady, telling them to follow and not deviate. The envoys obeyed without a word. They were brought to a station that was vast and clean, and it felt different from the council halls. It was quiet, efficient, and every human they saw moved with a purpose that made the aliens feel small. Inside a great chamber, they met Nathan Cole, a human diplomat. He was not angry, and he did not raise his voice. He greeted them with a calm smile, but his eyes were sharp like blades. The envoys explained their mission. They begged for aid. They spoke of starving worlds and burning colonies. They promised change. They promised respect. They promised anything, if only the humans would return. Nathan Cole listened, and when they were done, he sat in silence for a long moment. Then he said, "Humanity remembers everything," he said. "When you mocked our ships, we still guarded your skies. When you dismissed our medicine, we still healed your children. When you spat at our soldiers, we still bled for your wars. And when we asked only for respect, you laughed." He leaned forward and said, "We are watching now, but we will not return. Not until you show real change, not words but actions, not speeches but proof." The envoys pleaded. They said their people would suffer, that without humans entire civilizations would fall. Nathan only nodded and said, "Perhaps that is what must happen. Perhaps only then will you understand." He stood, and the guards led the envoys back to their ships. The aliens left with heavy hearts, and when they looked once more at the human fleets that watched them in silence, they felt smaller than ever. They had come to beg, and they had failed. When they returned to the council, the news spread quickly, and the people learned that humans had not returned. They learned that the humans had listened and then turned away again, and the anger grew sharper. Some shouted that it was the fault of their leaders, some shouted that it was punishment for arrogance, and some whispered that maybe the humans would never come back at all. The council chambers fell into chaos. Worlds argued and threatened, and the unity that had once held them together was gone. In the streets of countless cities, the people gathered to watch the broadcasts of the envoys speaking of human fleets larger than anything they had imagined, and of the human diplomat who spoke with no fear. And those images made the common people tremble, because they realized that humanity had grown stronger while the council had grown weaker. The people began to say, "The humans do not need us. It is we who needed them." And the words spread, until even children repeated them. In quiet moments, Nathan Cole looked out at the stars from his station. He thought of the suffering beyond human borders. He felt sorrow, but he also felt the weight of his people's choice. He whispered that humanity had given enough, and now it was time to see if the galaxy could stand alone, and with that, the fleets remained on guard, silent and powerful, watching the galaxy crumble while Earth thrived behind walls of steel and fire. The silence in the council chamber felt heavier than stone, and every alien voice that had once shouted at humans now whispered with fear. They were no longer sure of their power, and they were no longer certain of their future, because the humans had left, and the humans had left not in anger, but with a cold silence that was far more terrifying. And in that silence, each council member remembered the look in the human eyes before they turned and walked away. There was no threat spoken yet. It carried the weight of 1,000 wars, and it haunted them day and night, because they had all seen the humans fight before, and they knew what would happen if those humans ever chose to return on Earth. Men and women who had stood as envoys, soldiers, and builders now tried to make a new life in peace. They did not celebrate their departure. They only worked in quiet determination, building ships that could go farther than any council map had ever shown, building defenses that no spy could see, and building bonds among themselves stronger than any treaty, because they knew deep inside that the galaxy had not learned its lesson, and that one day the call of survival would once again reach Earth, and they would need to stand ready. People like John and Claire and Marcus and Leah trained not for war but for survival. They trained young ones in the old ways of Earth resilience. They showed them how to farm the hard ground, how to repair machines with little, and how to keep faith in one another, because they believed survival was more than weapons. It was spirit, in the halls of the council. However, cracks began to spread like glass under pressure. Some argued they should beg humans to return. Others whispered about striking Earth before it grew too strong, but none of them truly dared. Because the memory of past battles burned like fire in their minds. They had seen fleets erased in moments. They had seen planets defended by humans in ways that defied all reason. And they feared the quietness of Earth more than they feared its rage. So they argued and argued, yet no choice seemed safe. Every time they thought of making a move, someone would remind them of the simple truth that humans were unpredictable, and that unpredictability was the sharpest blade. Meanwhile, far out on the rim, stations and colonies whispered rumors of human scouts seen in unknown systems, not aggressive, only watching quietly. Some said they were building an empire in the shadows. Others said they were searching for something greater than war, a future no council could ever imagine. In dark bars and markets, traders spoke of strange ships that bore no council flag, ships that moved like ghosts through space, and no pirate dared to test them because even the bravest smuggler had heard the stories of what happened to those who did. The legend of humans began to grow larger than reality, and in that legend, the galaxy began to shape its fears. Claire stood one evening on the hills outside the human capital, and she looked up at the stars. She remembered the chamber where the council had shouted and insulted her people. She remembered the way silence fell when humans left, and she knew that silence had changed the galaxy more than any weapon. She whispered to John, who stood beside her, that they had done the right thing, and John only nodded. He knew words were not needed because the weight of history was already moving on its own path. But fate has a way of testing silence. A small war began in the outer sectors between two minor races, and at first the council ignored it. But then ships vanished, trade routes collapsed, and whispers spread that perhaps humans were behind it. Though no proof was found, the fear grew stronger and stronger. Soon the council was paralyzed, unable to move, afraid of making the wrong choice, afraid of drawing the attention of Earth. Every debate ended the same, with silence, because no one dared be the one to risk awakening humanity. On Earth, Leah wrote messages for the younger ones, telling them stories of old wars, not to glorify them, but to remind them of cost. She told them that every scar on Earth soil was a lesson. Every broken city rebuilt was a promise. She said humans had walked away, not because they were weak, but because they were strong enough to choose silence, and that was a lesson greater than victory, because victory ends, but silence lives on in the minds of those who fear it. She taught them that the greatest power was not always in the strike but in the restraint. Yet even as she spoke, a shadow moved across the stars, one that neither humans nor council expected. Something old awoke beyond the maps, a threat greater than any war the galaxy had ever seen, and whispers began that perhaps only humans could face it. The council trembled in fear because they knew they had broken trust with the only species who had never surrendered, and now they feared those humans might not answer if called. The weight of their mistake pressed down like a storm, and they realized too late that their arrogance had cost them allies they could never replace on Earth. John looked at the new ships rising from the yards, and he felt a chill he did not yet know of the coming storm. But he sensed it deep in his bones. He told Claire that their silence might soon be broken, not by choice but by necessity. And Claire did not argue because she too felt it. The stars were restless. The night seemed longer, and every wind carried whispers of change. The humans had walked away, but the aftermath was only beginning, and the galaxy would soon learn what it meant to live in a universe where Earth chose its own path.